variety of directions right now, one of which is bringing you
We have
forums
two
like
microphones
this.
for you.
Oh,
Both of them.
okay.
I'm official now. Thumbs up. So as I was saying, the Land and Housing Circle here at First Church is over 20 members strong now. We meet on the third Monday of every month to talk about what we here at First Church can do to help address Portland's housing crisis. And we're working in a variety of different ways. One of them is today's forum and many of the forums that we're hosting throughout the fall. Another is that we're working on finding opportunities for First Church members to be engaged in our community. And we have our first opportunity for you coming up on November 18th. We are sending a group of First Church members to Path Home to volunteer. So if you've not been to Path Home or you'd like an opportunity to put your faith into action, there's a sign-up sheet at the back of the room and you can put your name there and go with us, and we'll be working inside the shelter to just help support however we can. Might be cleaning, organizing, getting the shelter ready for new families. They'll let us know what they need when we get there, but it'll be a great way to go see the shelter and meet some of their staff and just be involved. So I hope you'll consider coming with us. And I think that's it. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Phyllis, who's going to introduce our speaker today.
You get two microphones. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here. I am Phyllis Leonard. I've been at this church about 14 years and on the board for what was Portland Homeless Family Solutions for 13 years. And I started out volunteering, making meals, and chose this church as my faith community when I moved back to Portland all those years ago, and chose this church because of the shelter. I wanted to understand what was going on in our city. And boy, I got quite the education, and I continue to. I get to introduce Brandi today, and boy, we've been hanging out together now for 13 years, and we've learned a lot from each other, and not only have we gotten to work together, but we're friends, for sure. It's such a pleasure to get to have you know what's going on in this Path Home realm, and she is the perfect person to fill us in on all the important things that are going on in our community that you can be part of. Cheers. Here you go, Brandi Tuck. You're gonna use it? Oh, yep. Thank you. Yeah, that works better.
Hi, everybody. It is such a pleasure to be here and see so many friends from so many years. Thank you for having me here. So today, what we're going to talk about is homelessness. We're going to talk about what is homelessness, what is this homelessness crisis that we keep hearing about? How did we get here and how bad is it really? How do we solve homelessness and how you can help solve homelessness? But first, we're going to do a little bit of history. Diana asked me to just highlight a little bit of our history together. The Goose Hollow Family Shelter was founded here at the First United Methodist Church in 1994. I like to point out I was 11. And the shelter was founded by about 40 or 60 volunteers, some of whom are probably in this room today, one of whom is still on our board, Miss Sonia. And the shelter ran for a little over a decade on kind of a shoestring budget and a lot of volunteer power. In 2005, I became a volunteer. I moved to Portland in 2005 from Florida and started volunteering. I had a big passion for working with people experiencing homelessness. So I started volunteering at the shelter, and 2 years later, in 2007, the executive director, Annie Hart, left the shelter to go over to Family Promise over in Hillsborough. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's my dream job, but they'll never give me that job because I'm only 24 years old, and I almost didn't apply. I didn't submit my application till the very last day that the job was open. And then I got the job. And we have people here who were on that SPRC committee back in 2007 who hired me. At that time, the budget was $78,000 a year, and we had 4 part-time staff, including me. In 2008, we went through a process of creating Portland Homeless Family Solutions to take over the operation of the shelter so that we could grow and expand and serve more families and have a deeper impact. And so from 2008 to 2018, I was here pretty much every single day of my life. And we really quickly grew PHFS. We first started a day shelter over at First Unitarian Church, about 8 blocks away, so that we had 23 hours a day of care for families. Then in 2012, we had the big idea, the new idea, which was we wanted to help families from the shelter move back into permanent housing. So we hired some housing specialists and started helping families move directly from homelessness back into housing. I skipped one. 2010 is when we went year round. So we went 2009 we started salmon, 2010 we went year round, 2012 we started our housing program. And then in 2017 we started our homeless prevention program. Then in 2018, we came up with our big moonshot vision. We wanted to own property, have 24 hours of care, be closer to where the families' lives were centered, which is really East County and East Portland. And so we launched this wild capital campaign to try to raise $3 million in 5 months. And with many people in this very room supporting us, we were able to do that, and we bought our Family Village campus out in Lentz. And in 2018, we left downtown and moved over to our Lentz campus. And today, in 2023, our annual budget is $5 million a year, and we have almost 50 staff who work at Path Home. We changed our name about a year ago to Path Home so the reason why we were called Portland Homeless Family Solution, I thought it was so clever and that every single person would get it really fast. Goose Hollow Family Shelter is GHFS. Portland Homeless Family Solutions is PHFS. I thought everyone would see it and get it and be, oh my gosh, that's so smart. 0 people got it. And it's really hard to say. I mean, I and probably most of you have mixed up the words or mixed up the letters over the years. So finally, we decided in 2022 to change our name to Path Home, and we love it. It feels almost like we've always been Path Home. There are some core values that I and we learned here at FUMC from operating the Goose Hollow Family Shelter, and those core values prevail at Path Home today. One of them is dignity, building dignity for the families that we serve. And that one of the biggest representations was the partitions, the cubicles that pull out from the walls that gave families a little bit of privacy and a little bit of dignity. And so that really has stuck with us and is one of our main core values today. A focus on relationships, that it was families supporting families, it was people sitting down together over dinner, over breakfast, and getting to know the families with children who stayed at Goose Hollow Family Shelter. And not only having the relationships with the families, but relationships with the volunteers and each other and community partners. And that has definitely stayed a core value of ours. And then, of course, volunteer engagement. The shelter started as a completely volunteer-run project with 0 paid staff. And we still have hundreds of volunteers every single year that come and help at Family Village and help at Path Home. Okay, so let's talk about homelessness. How did we get here? We have pretty much always had homelessness in America. From the day that we were founded, we came over, took indigenous land, there was no white people infrastructure on that land, and we had homelessness. Through colonial America, up through the Civil War and the Industrial Revolution, we had lots and lots of homelessness. Think about Upton Sinclair and the tenement villages that we've read about. And the government's response to homelessness was, it's not my problem. The government didn't do anything during the first many, many decades that America was a country. Instead, the government created an IRS tax code where wealthy philanthropists like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Ford could give money to charities like soup kitchens and settlement houses and hull houses so that They could address the people who were poor and hungry and living on the streets, but the government didn't invest any money or any policy in that arena until the Great Depression. And at that time, we had the largest economic downturn in our nation's history, and the government was really forced to act. And what the government did was a bunch of different things. Created the WPA Works program to send people back to work at a living wage, reformed the mortgage industry. Before the Great Depression, all the mortgages were only 5-year mortgages, and you had to have enough capital to pay off your home in 5 years. We reformed that to the 25-year mortgage that we know and love today, so that more average folks could participate in owning a home and building wealth. Owning property is the fastest way to build wealth in America. We created entitlement programs like Social Security and unemployment insurance, and all of those things were essentially available to qualified white people. For everyone else, the people of color, immigrants, LGBTQ populations, people with disabilities, we created the Federal Housing Administration, and we started funding it at $80 billion a year to build and maintain affordable housing all over the country. And it worked. From the 40s all the way to the 80s, we were investing $80 billion a year in creating and maintaining housing, and homelessness largely went away. We didn't have homelessness in the middle part of the century. And then in the late 70s and early 80s, 2 big policy decisions changed our housing history. The first in the late 70s is that we dismantled and defunded the inpatient mental health hospital due to things like the Oregon Hospital here in Salem that was featured in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where there were some really bad practices happening. And so the government said, you got to close these inpatient places, that you can't hold people in institutions anymore. And the federal government directed communities to create coordinated care solutions so that all the people who were being discharged from these institutions would be able to find care in their local communities. Well, that never happened, and now it's 45 years later, and we still don't have any coordinated community care for people living with severe and persistent mental illness. The other thing in the early 80s is that the federal government defunded that housing administration from $80 billion a year down to $20 billion a year. And the effect was that all of this housing that we were building, new construction halted. We stopped building housing. And all the housing that we had built over 40 years had no money to be maintained and repaired. And so it became some really bad properties, fell into disrepair. We called it the projects, and there were also some really racist zoning decisions that were made in inner cities where white flight happened to the suburbs. We changed the inner city zoning codes to be industrial. What happens when you bring industry into a place? It gets really torn down, the roads get really crummy, the air gets polluted, there's a lot of just not good environment. And so of course we blamed the people, the Black, brown, and indigenous people who were living in those inner cities for that dilapidation. So we went in and we tore down all of the dilapidated housing projects. And I remember when I was a kid in the early 90s, I would watch on TV as things like Cabrini Green would be dynamited and everyone would cheer. But what we were doing was tearing down our nation's infrastructure of housing. If we went around and dynamited all the bridges and the roads, we wouldn't be able to claim that we had a national transportation infrastructure. And that's literally what we did with our housing infrastructure, is we tore it down. The result was that we had another epidemic of homelessness in the late 80s and the early 90s when Goose Hollow Family Shelter was founded. There were, again, people and individuals and families with children living outside because there wasn't enough safe, decent, affordable housing for people to live. And so in the early 90s, the government did choose to step in again, to act, to make some policy and to commit some funding. But whereas in the 30s and 40s, they created this housing administration and built housing, in the 90s, they created emergency response systems and shelters and street outreach and emergency clinics. And so we invested in a lot of homelessness response systems, but they were crisis response and not permanent responses. And ever since then, we've had an epidemic of homelessness in this community. In 2015 was the first time in Oregon, in Portland, that we declared homelessness a state of emergency, and things have only gotten worse since. There are many faces of homelessness. There are many people who experience homelessness. There are the people living downtown in Old Town that we see on the street, people living with severe and persistent mental illness. But there's also a lot of kids who experience homelessness. We know that, sorry, I'm just pulling up my notes. There are tons of children and families that experience homelessness. There's also families, seniors, veterans, domestic violence survivors, people with disabilities. Of our total clients at Path Home, 56% of them are kids. The Oregon reports that 59% of the families with children in our state that experience homelessness lived unsheltered in 2022. That means that they're living in cars, in tents, on the street. In fact, Oregon has the highest rate of unsheltered family homelessness in the entire country. When we talk about trends in homelessness, the country usually says things like families with children, in terms of total populations of people that experience homelessness, are decreasing, except in Oregon. It's increasing. Among the nation's major metropolitan areas, Portland ranks second in the country for having the highest number of families with children who experience homelessness. And so we talk a lot about how many people are experiencing homelessness, but what does the data say about how many people experience homelessness? We rely on some different data sources. The one-night street and shelter count is one of them. We do it every odd-numbered year. We just did the 2023 one, and the numbers are, I just saw the preliminary numbers on Friday. It's about 6,300 people that experience homelessness in Multnomah County. But that's only one of the data sets that we use. The Oregon Department of Education also tracks how many kids experience homelessness every school year. And the data shows from Oregon Department of Education that about 3,000 students a year experience homelessness in Multnomah County. And that doesn't count their little brothers and sisters who are not yet school age. At Path Home, for the 16 years that I've worked here, half of the kids that we serve are under 5. So I would argue there's probably another 2,000 or 3,000 little kiddos out there who experience homelessness every year. So now we're up to 5,000 or 6,000 kids plus all their parents. So maybe that's 7,000 or 8,000 kids and parents that experience homelessness in Multnomah County every year. And yet, when we look at this one-night street and shelter count, we're talking about 6,300 total individuals, and so something is off. There's some other data trends that we think about. People who are unsheltered between 2009 and 2019 increased in Multnomah County by 22%. There was also a loss of services. We've been closing shelters and closing transitional housing programs, but we're also moving a lot of people into permanent housing. And by and large, once people move into permanent housing, they stay in that housing. 83% of people moved into housing in 2020 kept their housing 18 months later. And so if we've gotten so good at ending homelessness and moving people from homelessness back into housing, why do we still have homelessness? It's because homelessness is systemic and societal, and yet we are trying to solve it at the individual levels. It's not that our programs aren't working. Our programs are working. At Path Home, 87% of the families that we serve keep their housing for good once we move them into permanent housing. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about what this looks like. And so how are we having so much homelessness when our programs are so effective? There are not only Path Home, but dozens of organizations around our metro area that are really successful at moving people from homelessness back into housing. So why do we still have housing or still have homelessness? Let's see, I haven't been keeping up with my notes, so I'm gonna try to keep back up with them. Let's see, okay, so essentially we haven't given enough resources to preventing homelessness in the first place. I'm gonna talk about these words inflow and outflow. And I actually hate these words because we're talking about people here, but we're using inflow and outflow. Inflow is the number of people who are falling into homelessness, and outflow is the number of people who are moving from homelessness back into housing. And so essentially what's going on right now is that we have lots more people becoming homeless than who are exiting homelessness, the outflow. And the inflow outpaces the outflow by a lot. We have an eviction crisis in this country where people are falling into homelessness all the time. Job loss and job reduction exacerbated by COVID just made it worse. And with the reduction of these services like shelter and especially transitional housing, people have nowhere to go except the streets. We have torn down all of our affordable housing, and so there isn't anywhere for folks to go. So the camps get bigger and bigger, and our visible homeless crisis gets worse and worse. Another challenge is that we're not scaling the solutions that we have to meet the demands. As I mentioned earlier, we know that lots of programs that help people move from homelessness to housing are very successful, and they produce the kind of outcomes that we want to see. But because we're not talking about how many people are falling into homelessness, we're not talking about the inflow, we're not being realistic about how many programs and what budgets and what size of response we actually need. And so we're not scaling the programs up to help everyone who is on the streets. We keep relying on these flawed data systems like the point-in-time count to figure out how much funding we need, how many shelters we need, how much housing assistance we need, and we're not paying attention to the rest of the data. We're not looking at the Oregon Department of Education resources, and so we just aren't sizing our solutions at the right level. Even though we are pumping so much money into homelessness right now, we'll have $2.5 billion over the next decade. We are doing it in a way that is not efficient or effective. Our systems are not connected together. And so when someone gets into shelter, they don't necessarily have access to housing resources. There are some people, not at Path Home, but in the larger Multnomah County system, that languish in shelter for up to 2 or 3 years with no hope of even getting out of shelter because there are no housing resources for them. When people do get into housing, there aren't resources to help them get whatever underlying issues have led to their homelessness. There's no resources to get those issues addressed. There's no mental health care, there's no employment training, there's no domestic violence advocacy, there's no recovery assistance. And so it's this vicious cycle that we're in because people aren't being realistic about the number of people who are actually experiencing homelessness, and we're not coordinating all the services that people need to end homelessness for good. Let's see. We are focusing on outputs rather than outcomes. Outcomes are the differences made by outputs. The examples of some outputs are things like the number of shelter beds we have, the number of people sheltered, the number of people who move into housing, the number of youth who access day centers. These are all great services. These are great outputs. But in order to end homelessness, we need to be tracking the change that people experience. We need to be focusing on things like decreasing the length of time that people experience homelessness, making sure that people can keep their housing for good, for long term. We need to make sure that we are limiting the inflow into homelessness by preventing homelessness before it starts, and like I said, increasing our homeless retention rates. And so we're not addressing systemic causes. We are really focusing at these individual output levels, and we're not thinking larger about what's going on in homelessness. And so we're going to talk about some of the systemic causes of homelessness. First, housing is too expensive and jobs don't pay enough. At the same time that we have thousands of people sleeping outside on the streets, we also have thousands of available apartments where people could live. The problem is that these thousands of available apartments are not affordable to people who make very low or no incomes. The average 2-bedroom apartment in Multnomah County right now costs about $1,600 a month. In order for that to be affordable housing, lowercase affordable housing, means that it needs to cost 30% of your income or less. So if you're paying $1,600 a month on housing, you need to be able to make about $55,000 a year for that to be affordable on your income. But we know that minimum wage earners make nowhere near that, right? So on our current about $15 an hour minimum wage right now, folks bring home a little under $30,000 a year. So for those minimum wage earners to find a place that's affordable on their income, they would have to find a home that cost around $800 or less. And if anyone here knows of any homes that cost $800, please call me right now, because we just know that that's not a reality, right? People are spending 60, 70, even 80% of their income on their housing costs. And when you try to add this up, the math just doesn't add up. If you're a low-income minimum wage earner, you bring home about $2,000 a month take home after taxes. We're going to spend $1,600 a month on housing, and then when you factor in things like childcare for families, which is on average $1,000 per month per kid, we are negative $600 or $700, and we haven't paid for utilities, phone bills, transportation costs, food, recreational activities. So you can see the math just doesn't add up. The wages are not in line with what we need in our community to be able to afford housing. A minimum wage earner would have to work about 87 hours a week in order to afford the average 2-bedroom apartment. Another systemic issue is our eviction crisis. The eviction crisis is largely tied to our housing affordability crisis. And because people cannot afford housing and wages haven't kept up, people are losing their housing all the time and they're falling into homelessness. The Federal Reserve did a study that showed that 40% of Americans couldn't come up with $400 in an emergency if they had to. That is almost half of our country's population, that if they blow a tire or a kid gets sick and they can't go to work or they lose their job for some reason, they will not be able to sustain themselves. They will not be able to survive. People are living paycheck to paycheck. The eviction crisis is only getting worse. In 2021, we had 306 evictions filed, and a year later in 2022, almost 3 times that, 806 evictions filed. And when folks lose their housing, it becomes a crisis. And we're going to talk about what happens in a little bit when you lose your housing. But it can turn into a trauma, which has lifetime effects, especially on child development, but also on things like health outcomes and just quality of life. As a system in Multnomah County, we spend the least amount of money preventing homelessness before it starts, even though it is the most cost-effective solution, and it prevents all of those adverse health outcomes and prevents all of those challenges in child development. Another systemic cause is structural racism and the racial wealth gap. The housing market has intentionally and systematically denied home ownership to people of color, immigrants, people with disabilities, LGBTQ people, and other minority groups. Things like redlining, which is the practice of taking a map of a community and finding out where all the people of color live, drawing a red line around that, and banks agreeing not to give mortgages to the people who live in those areas. Discriminatory lending practices. In Oregon, we had a state-imposed tax on all residents of color for many, many years at our founding. And displacement through gentrification. All of these things have created generations of people of color who have been prohibited, systematically and intentionally prohibited, from accumulating wealth and transferring wealth between generations. As I said, we know that owning property is the fastest way to accumulate wealth in our country, and we have systematically denied that opportunity by redlining folks' neighborhoods and refusing to let them buy property there. Today, the average white family transitions about $140,000 between generations, whereas the average black family only $9,300. Historically, Oregon has a particularly bad track record when it comes to racial discrimination. We were founded as a white utopia, the only land north of the Mason-Dixon line where a white person could come and be free from people of color. Some folks of color could come to Oregon and work, but we were a sundown state. You had to be out of the entire state by sundown, or else you were arrested, fined, or even worse. Oregon also refused to recognize the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution from the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal rights and responsibilities to everyone, until 1973. That was over 100 years after it passed at the federal level. So we didn't offer equal rights to people until the 1970s. But this oppression and discrimination continues still to this day, both locally and nationally, even with equal rights protections. Once redlining was outlawed, banks just changed their practices. The subprime mortgage crisis was the largest land grab in U.S. history, where we seized and transferred $200 billion of assets from communities of color and transferred them back over to white-owned banks. When folks of color, when they first were allowed to be able to go and get mortgages for their homes, the mortgage brokers would say, a white person would come in with a certain credit profile, and they would run their credit and say, okay, here's 3 different options for mortgages, and they would get to their choice of an FHA or a standard or a subprime mortgage, and we would get to choose and talk that out. An average black family with the exact same credit profile would come in and have that exact same credit run, and they would only be offered the subprime mortgage. And so this transfer of wealth, this $200 billion transfer of wealth from black and brown families back into white-owned banks, wiped out any generational wealth that had been accumulated, and once again left generations of folks of color with nothing. So what about these other root causes of homelessness that we talk about? Things like drug abuse, mental health, addiction, and poverty. There's a new book out called Homelessness is a Housing Problem, and it's a couple of researchers from King County in Seattle that went through and kind of listed all the root causes that people talk about in our communities, and they went and they tried to find any statistical correlation with these different things. So if we're going to say that poverty is the cause of homelessness, very high poverty communities should have lots of homelessness, right? Well, so they went to Detroit, one of the highest poverty communities in our country, and they looked in every kind of statistical analysis that they could, and they found absolutely no correlation with poverty and homelessness. Detroit actually has very little homelessness. So if it's drug addiction, let's go to the center of the opioid crisis, West Virginia, Appalachia. And if we're saying that drug addiction causes homelessness, there should be tons of people in West Virginia that experience homelessness. And yet there are very, very few. They looked at things like weather patterns, availability of services, mental health care. They looked at all these different factors, and they found absolutely no correlation whatsoever with any of these root causes, except for 2. The 2 that they found correlation with were rent prices and vacancy rates. In communities with low vacancy rates, which means high rent prices, there is where they found very high and rampant homelessness. What they also found is that in the communities that had this high rent and low vacancy rate, those other things, poverty, addiction, mental health, those were the predictors of who in a community would experience homelessness, but they were not the actual causes of homelessness. And so in summary, the reason we are experiencing so much homelessness is because our inflow of people that fall into homelessness doesn't match our outflow. There are more people falling into homelessness every day. The scale of the great and amazing solutions that we have in our community doesn't meet the need. We're focusing on outputs, the number of shelter beds, the number of people, instead of the outcomes, the number of people that are ending homelessness for good. And we're addressing homelessness at the individual level when we actually need to be addressing it at the societal and systems level. So let's change gears a little bit and talk about the effects of homelessness. What happens in the brain of someone who experiences homelessness? When anyone's brain, any of our brains, anyone's brain in the world experiences stress, our brains release chemicals that help us get through that stress. If it's positive stress, like finals week at school, starting a new job, giving a big presentation, getting a new puppy even, our brain releases chemicals that help us get through that stress by promoting things like emotional regulation, critical thinking, logical thought, emotional balance, all really good things. Maybe you've thought about a time when you were really, really nervous about something, starting a new job or giving a big presentation, and you get up there and you just nail it and you feel like you had this burst of energy that you've never had before. That's brain chemicals. But then there's also another kind of stress response, distress, negative stress. And this is the kind of stress that as we were evolving as humans, we developed this kind of stress when our lives were literally in danger. When there was a wild animal running at us, or we think about the story where there's a kid trapped underneath the car and there's some superhuman strength to lift the car off the kid. This kind of distress chemical response releases chemicals that do something different. They turn off the prefrontal cortex of the brain. They turn off the critical thinking, logical, rational part of the brain, and they put you down in your brainstem, in the part of your brain that is responsible for survival mode, fight, flight, and freeze response that helps us momentarily release this chemical response and save our lives. And that's really helpful when there's a lion running at you in the wild. But the thing is that our brains release this exact same kind of stress chemical when we experience stress like emotional abuse, domestic violence, neglect, and homelessness. And when you experience homelessness for days, weeks, months, or years, your brain stays in that chemical response the whole time. Your prefrontal cortex is turned off, and it's turned off through a chemical reaction. So it's not like if you just tried really hard, you'd be able to bring that prefrontal cortex back online. It is offline for good. We only have survival mode, fight, flight, or freeze response. And so what happens when we experience homelessness for these prolonged times is that our brain starts to think that we're always supposed to be in a survival mode distress response. And our brain starts literally rewiring itself to believe that we are always in danger, that there is something that is affecting our ability to live right around the corner. So we are hypervigilant about finding where that danger is coming from, and we can't concentrate, we can't tell time. They say you can only understand every third word that's said to you when you are in a survival mode response. And the result is that people feel really unsafe. The world doesn't make sense. It's really confusing. And so people get really depressed because the world doesn't make sense. They can't function like they're supposed to. I remember when we were here at Goose Hollow, families would call us. We used to have a curfew at 8:00 p.m. And families would call us at like 7:42 and say, oh, hey, I'm on my way from Gresham. I'm hopping on the Max. I'll be there. And it's like, but you're supposed to be here in 18 minutes. It's going to take you an hour and a half to get here on the Max from Gresham. And they would get in trouble for that. And what we know now is that their brains couldn't tell, like, oh, I'm in Gresham. I'm getting on the Max. I'm going to shelter. I'll make it there by 8. Their brains couldn't do that logical thinking of hour and a half. You need to leave an hour and a half early at 6:30 to get to the shelter by 8, because the brain literally can't think that way. And what happens when our brains are in this perpetual system of survival mode, of fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, is that as a kid, it disrupts our neural development. It disrupts our childhood experience by having this distress. It leads to social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. Those can lead to health risk behaviors. When you don't understand what's going on in the world and everything seems so confusing, and the way that you're used to showing up and the way you're used to responding to things physically can't happen, you get really upset and depressed, and so you turn to health risk behaviors like addiction. I often say addiction is not the cause of homelessness, it's the effect of homelessness. You do things like resort to criminal activity, early sexual behaviors. These things lead to disease and disability and ultimately early death. The average lifespan of someone who experiences homelessness is only 49 years old. So let's talk about solutions. How do we deal with homelessness? What does a systemic response to homelessness actually look like? Well, first of all, it looks like having accurate real-time data that can tell us exactly how many people are experiencing homelessness so that we can match the size of our solutions. We can fund enough money to really be able to solve the problem. It looks like going upstream and helping people prevent homelessness in the first place. As I said, this is the most cost-effective solution. We provide this kind of intervention at Path Home, and whereas it costs about $12,000 to $15,000 per household to help someone move from homelessness to housing, it only costs about $3,000 per household to prevent homelessness before it starts. And then we also prevent that survival mode distress response. We prevent that crisis from happening And a lot of times the kids don't even know that they're about to lose their housing, and they just go on to school and everything is fine and everything is normal. It looks like strengthening our crisis response systems and our shelter systems to be able to meet the need that people have. It looks like making sure that when you are in shelter, you have housing resources. It looks like when you are in housing, you have all the resources that you need to be able to keep your housing, mental health care, domestic violence advocacy, all the different things that folks need. There is the solution to homelessness is this intervention called Housing First, rapid rehousing, that has 3 components. First, it's helping people minimize the time that they experience homelessness and move quickly back into housing. It's providing rent assistance and client assistance to help people stabilize in their housing, and lots of organizations do that. But there's a third piece, and it's providing long-term practical help for folks so that they can keep their housing long-term. We need to be creating housing opportunities of all kinds. We need to reinvest in our housing infrastructure by building affordable housing, but it's also about using all kinds of other types of housing. Motels, single room occupancies. We used to have all kinds of those in Portland and across the country, and we really don't have a lot of them anymore. Group homes, communal living, residential infill through duplexes and triplexes, RVs, tiny homes, pre-made housing. There's even out in John Day, they're experimenting with 3D printing of housing. There are so many different ways that we can build housing and increase the amount of housing that we have. We can provide the supportive services to people so that people can sustain themselves in housing once they have those homes. Things like mental health, domestic violence advocacy, health and wellness, substance abuse training, educational and employment training, childcare, transportation, so many different things. And in order to do this, we need to make sure that we're paying a living wage to the folks who are engaging in this work. And so in summary, we need real-time data. We need to go upstream. We need to focus on our current crisis response system and focus on trauma-informed care, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Create more housing opportunities and help people sustain themselves in the housing that we have. While it's true that we don't have enough affordable housing in Multnomah County to care for all the people who need a home, it's not true that we don't have enough housing overall. Right now in Multnomah County, there are 6,000 available units of housing. They're just not affordable to people who make very low or no incomes. So if we prioritized our dollars right, like I said, we have $2.5 billion over a decade that we can use to end homelessness. And what we're using it for right now are mass camps, safe rest villages, porta potties, hygiene stations, vector control, which is rat control at homeless camps. If we took these tens of millions of dollars a year, right now it costs for this mass encampment over on Gideon near OMSI, the new mass encampment, it costs $4,000 per tent per month to have people camp there. You know what's cheaper than that? Rent. Even at these places on Division and Williams and overlooking the St. John's Bridge, we could buy these places, rent these places that are $2,800, $3,200 a month, make camping not allowed. I don't think we should arrest people, but we can say you can't camp anymore, move people into housing, support them with long-term resources and wraparound services, and we could end our homelessness crisis pretty quickly if we chose to use our resources in the right way. You can be part of this solution. You can educate your friends and your neighbors and your community and your faith community about what we're talking about here today. You can advocate to elected officials. Myself and all of my colleagues, the executive directors of about 20 other social service organizations here in Portland, we advocate for these solutions all the time, and the city and the county don't listen to us. But they might listen to you all, especially if there was a lot of you. You can be a YIMBY and say yes in my backyard when it comes to things like siting shelters and affordable housing complexes and building housing. And when there is a solution to homelessness proposed, ask these 3 questions. How much housing will this create? How quickly will people be moved into that housing? And what services will be available to people in housing, and how quickly? That is how we will end homelessness. So really fast, I'll talk about Path Home and where we are today. Our mission is to empower homeless families with children to get back into housing and stay there. Last year, we served 524 families, almost 1,900 kids and parents. Since we were created in 2008 as a nonprofit, we've served over 3,000 families. It's about 10,000 kids and parents. We have 5 main programs that support families from crisis to stability. We have a street outreach program where we help families who are living outside in cars and tents and on the streets connect to mainstream resources, both at Path Home and at other organizations around the community. Of course, we run our beloved Family Village shelter. We have up to 17 families with children who each get their own individual private rooms with locking doors and real furniture and real beds. Last year, 96% of the families who stayed in shelter moved back into housing, and the average length of stay was only 87 days. Family Village is the first shelter in Oregon that was designed with trauma-informed design and architecture. This kind of design helps people heal from the crisis and trauma of homelessness and leads to better outcomes, like 96% of people moving into housing and those really short lengths of stay. 73% of the people that stay at Family Village are BIPOC. 70% of families who stay, or parents who stay in shelter, are working while they're in shelter. And like I said, this is the first shelter in Oregon with trauma-informed design and architecture, and there's only 2. We and Rosehaven Day Shelter are the only 2 programs in the state that are featuring this kind of innovative design. Some of the features, it's a connection to nature through natural light and real plants indoors and outdoors and natural materials. It's small areas so people can have flexibility and power and control over how they use spaces. It's about promoting emotional and physical safety and transparency and predictability. So I just have some photos, and some of you have been there, some of you haven't. I know some of you are coming in a couple weeks. This is the main entrance to the shelter. This is our main common area where we have a library, computer lab, 4 living spaces, and our little kids' play area. This is our little kids' play area where the kiddos get to play and have fun. This is what the bedrooms look like. Families have plants. Every time a family moves into shelter, in terms of their move-in kit, they get all new sheets and pillows and pillowcases and things like that, but they also get real plants to go in their space. This is one of our living room spaces. Again, there's real plants everywhere at Family Village. This is our rec room for teenage kids, our library. This is our garden. We have a garden outside that the families and the kids and the staff and the volunteers all work together. I take 0 credit for the garden. I look at it and I love it, but I don't work in it because you don't want me to work in the garden. And we have a playground that was donated by Nike. Our biggest program at Path Home is our Housing First program, where we helped 360 families last year move from homelessness to housing. About 87% of families keep their housing for good. And the reason why our percentage is so high for families keeping their housing is we provide really long-term retention support to families. We provide the housing and the love and the practical help that people need to keep their housing. We build trusting, long-lasting relationships and help people really be able to feel secure. Our homeless prevention program helps families prevent homelessness before it starts. And we have our newest program is our basic income guarantee program, where we are giving $575 a month to families for 2 years. Worldwide research shows that this is the fastest and most efficient way to end not only homelessness, but end poverty for people. And so we just finished our first 2-year cohort, and we're in the process right now of recruiting our second cohort with twice as many families. One of the moms in the first cohort said she didn't know how stressed out about money she was every single second of every single day until all of a sudden she wasn't. And now she's spending her time making dinner for her kids and engaging in their school activities. We have big plans for Family Village. Our campus includes some vacant parking lots that we haven't developed yet. And so we're going to be building 2 additional buildings on our Family Village campus. One will be 50 units of permanent affordable housing, and the other will be a wraparound services center where families will be able to come and access all the resources, relationships, and tools they need to end homelessness for good. We'll bring on-site domestic violence advocacy, mental health care, employment training, and childcare. And of course, I'll end by talking about how you can be involved. We still have most of the same volunteer roles that we had at Goose Hollow Family Shelter over at Family Village. We have our meal providers who bring brunch, sack lunches, and dinner. Kitchen helpers come and help our kitchen manager, Josh, in the kitchen. Mary does it all the time, works with Josh, helps prepare, serve, cook, clean up. We just opened the new commercial kitchen like a week ago, 2 weeks ago, so you get to come and work in this beautiful new kitchen. We have a turnover team that helps turn over the rooms so that when a family moves out into housing, we can get a new family in as quickly as possible. We have Kid Club host that comes kind of like the old Kid Time host we had here at the Goose, where you come and do crafts and activities and play with the kids. We just expanded the number of Kid Club hosts that we have. It's almost every day of the week now. And our grounds crew helps us with the gardening, the weeding, and the landscaping. Okay, I took a long time. That was a lot. But what questions do you all have? I'm curious what you all want to know. Yeah.
I was wondering about, I've worked with homeless populations in King County in Washington, Mary's Place I was connected with. I did a pastoral internship there. What is the policy now? One of the things I've always disagreed with is we get people into a shelter, they get to stay in the shelter from 8 o'clock at night until 7:30 in the morning, and then they're kicked out onto the street again. Is that still what people are doing? Because I found that people are, mostly women I work with, were traumatized. I mean, they needed a place to just regroup for a while and then maybe move into employment or whatever, but I couldn't wrap my head around why they kicked everybody out in the morning.
Yeah, so
even if they arrived the night before with
that's
their
right.
kids.
Yeah, so at Path Home, no, we do not. People are allowed to access Family Village 24 hours a day. There is no rule whatsoever about having to leave. So a lot of shelters still have that activity, and as we have learned more and more about trauma-informed care and what's going on in the brain, so trauma-informed care is the understanding that what's happening in the brain of someone who experiences homelessness, that they're in survival mode and they're in fight, flight, or freeze, and it's the commitment to create conditions that allow them to heal. And so one of the things that allows you to heal is by knowing that you can be somewhere always and that you have safety at all times of the day. So we used to do that here, but we don't anymore at Family Village. There are unfortunately so many shelters that don't participate in trauma-informed care. Some of them say that they do, but they don't actually. And so what happens is people have really negative experiences in shelter. They feel like they're dehumanized, they are traumatized, there are all of these rules and guidelines that they're supposed to know and understand and remember and follow when they don't have critical thinking, logic, rationality available to them. And so people have really bad experiences in shelter. They end up getting kicked out because they don't make it home on time or they don't leave in the morning on time. And then that makes them feel really bad about themselves. And they think, am I that dumb or that stupid that I can't, why did I get kicked out of shelter? I didn't do anything wrong, because their brains don't equate that they've done anything wrong. And so then they have an adversity to going to a different shelter. And so when we talk about people choosing to be outside and choosing to experience homelessness, often it's a trauma response where they have had so many bad experiences in shelter like this, like having to leave early in the morning or not be able to come back until a certain point. What if it's 32 degrees and snowing at 2 p.m. and you have nowhere to go because the shelter doesn't open till 7, right? That's really traumatizing and it's really painful for folks. And so a lot of this service resistant population, they call them, they're not service resistant. They just don't want to be pained and humiliated and demeaned by going to these programs that make them feel really bad about themselves.
How long is your aftercare?
Yeah.
Because also, a lot of times it would be 6 months, it would be a year, and then when it ended, certainly not every family would end up back in homelessness, but more than needed to. And it's if they need it for 10 years, who cares? Check in with them once a month. Sometimes I don't understand the thinking around not providing what people need.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and this is really what is unique and different about Path Home, is there is no limit for how long people get to experience case management and participate in retention support. Sometimes it's 6 months. It's really depending on the family. We use this evidence-based practice called progressive engagement, which means that no two families are the same. And so no two families probably need the same thing. So every family gets a different set of services that are really tailored to whatever their situation is. So some families we're with for 2, 3, 6, 8 years. I've watched some kids grow up from like 4 years old to now they're in high school. They're not in shelter, but they're in our housing retention services for sure. And so we stick with the families for as long as they need us. Yeah, you, and then.
Is there a minimum age to volunteer?
So 10 years old is our minimum age, and you have to be with your parents. But if you're 10 or older and your parents are willing to come with you, then you can volunteer at Path Home.
A couple of quick questions. When was the, I'm going to call it an attack, when was the subprime mortgage attack?
2008.
Really?
Yep. That was, yep.
Okay, so double whammy on a lot of people.
Yeah.
And then I heard recently that the programs from 1940 to 1980 were focused on white males. True or false?
Well, a lot of the New Deal programs were, the housing wasn't. The housing administration created housing where people that didn't get work programs and college programs, the GI Bill, those were very much focused on white men. And for everyone else that didn't get to go to college and own homes and build wealth, the federal government created the projects, the housing, the very affordable housing programs. And that's where they were able to live. And it was, definitely segregated by socioeconomic status, but they at least had very nice, decent, safe, affordable housing and didn't have to experience homelessness. Cheryl.
Brandi, I have a change of direction question. You mentioned that it costs $12,000 a year to move a family out of homelessness into housing, but $3,000, I'm assuming that's national data.
That's our data.
That's your, okay, that's good, that's good. What role would there be for the private sector to buy in to support that $3,000 program? I mean, is there some kind of fund y'all are running it? I mean, I'm assuming you're from, government dollars, but is there a private role for the private sector to be involved in what I call the very upstream, keeping those people in their houses, in their own environment, without any of the trauma moving in and out, right?
Cheryl, that's such a good question because our homelessness prevention program is funded 0% by the government.
Oh, really?
0% of our resources for prevention come from the government. 100% come from private dollars. And that's individuals like you all, it's foundations, and it's corporations that are funding that program. And right now we just got a big infusion of dollars, so it's about $500,000 a year that Path Home is investing in our homeless prevention program. And so if folks want to participate, yes, you can sponsor a family or 2 or 3, or even just half. Any resources that we get for that program go directly towards the families that we're preventing homelessness for. Great question. Yeah.
And looking at the data there, you're showing how many homes are actually available out there that are moving in and they're not staying in there. How can we get to the people that are powerful because the money is going somewhere else? They stood a guy on the street the other day and said, if this guy doesn't move out of 10, 24 hours, we're going to fine him $100. Give me a break. So is there a way to say that back when I remember my folks on the CC program and the depression hit and rolled up, they put up work programs. The city out there said, we can't hire anybody. We don't have enough people to work. Hire these people, a CCC type of thing, or subsidize so they can get their rent. So we're looking at the elephant here and not seeing another thing. We got to get to these people that are making decisions. They're feeling good stuff they're putting out there.
Yes.
And I don't know how we as a group or committees can say, our local politician or local thing can say, hey, look, here's what's going on, and we could give some of the data that you're showing. I don't think any of them see this, what you just showed us. I don't think they know that.
Yeah, so it's really the city and the county elected officials, the 5 city elected officials and the 5 county elected officials. That's
How do we
who.
reach those people where there's not nobody effective?
Yeah, I mean, you can show up they both have weekly meetings, and there are citizen commentary periods at the beginning of every single public meeting that they have. You can show up and sign up to testify publicly and be there every single week talking about this.
Are you lobbying? You got a group that, are you lobbying as your organization? Because you got a lot more as a group than me standing.
We do. There's a group of about 20 nonprofit organizations that meet every single Monday at 4 p.m. And we meet with the county and the city, and we tell them all that I have just shared with you. And what they say to us is, well, the county, when we said, county, let's not fund these camps, instead let's fund these vacant apartments, this is a direct quote, they said, well, the devil's in the details. And so we just can't do that. What? And so I would say, they've been trying for how many years now to get these Safe Rest villages open? I would argue the devil's in the details there too, and they're still trying. So why can't we at least try this? When we went to the city and said all of this, the city said, well, you already have resources for Housing First. You were already doing housing. We're going to try the camps. And we said, nope, we're doing the camps. And it was almost like, over my dead body, will these camps not go forward? And we are we're flabbergasted by the response. And so we're asking you all, community members, who are not the CEOs and executive directors of all of these social service programs, you all show up. And if we get enough of our Portland electorate to say these things and to make voting choices where we are voting folks in who understand Housing First and are looking at the data, when we look at Path Home, 96% of our families from shelter last year moved into housing. Urban Alchemy is the nonprofit organization that's running that big mass 250-person tent camp shelter over on Gideon. You know what their success rate for moving people into housing is? 2% of families move from Urban Alchemy programs, from their camping programs, into permanent housing. And that we are investing tens of millions of dollars a year with them to run these mass encampments. We're paying Urban Alchemy more to run these mass encampments than the entire homeless family system is funded every single year. Did you have a question, and then you?
I was just going to say, thinking of people that when they have to leave a shelter at 7 or 7:30, sometimes there's daycare centers, but I'm not sure, because there used to be Rose City, I think, Women's Day Center.
Yeah.
And when I lived in Sacramento, Catholic Social Services had a shelter for men, a shelter for women, but they had to leave in the morning. But then they even had a parking lot for shopping carts. They had a library. They had a lounge. They had showers and laundry facilities. So they had things to support them, even though by regulation they could not have the shelters 24 hours.
Yeah, and we have some day services. We have Rosehaven Day Center, but there are thousands of women who experience homelessness every day, and dozens of women can go to Rosehaven every day because of their capacity, right? And Rosehaven is gorgeous. For Bud Clark Commons is the kind of any single person day center over on Broadway and Gleason or so. And again, thousands of people experience homelessness, and there maybe a couple hundred can go every day. So we do have some resources, they're just not enough. And they do have showers and laundry and mailing addresses, and there's a clinic there, there's a barber shop there, but it's just not enough.
I wanted to speak to the resistance about just putting people in housing. I think the root of it is a belief that if you're not working, even though some people are, you don't get to reap the benefits of what society offers. So there's this misconception, or maybe it's even true, that there's some people who deserve these nice apartments, but it certainly isn't the people in homeless villages. Those people deserve what they have, which
That's right.
is practically nothing. Even if it costs us more, much more.
That's
because
right.
What would happen if we just let people have housing for free? I mean, this really is people's thinking.
It is.
I swear it is. Because
It
I
is.
heard it come out of their mouths.
It definitely
And
is.
it's definitely fanned by some of the right-wing people. And this idea of deserving, and it makes no sense, but I'm 71 now, so I've given up on anything making sense. But yeah, it makes perfect sense to me that they'll keep people in these villages, which are, I believe, unsafe for the neighborhood around, for the people that are there. And I feel sorry for both. I mean, for the neighbors that have to be dealing, but this resistance to just put people in nice 2-bedroom apartments at costing less
than the tents.
It's got to be just nastiness.
It is. It really is. And it's, it's a lack of understanding of what's going on in the brain of someone who's living in these camps, right? That these folks they're traumatized. They're in survival mode. And we say, well, go get a job. Well, you can't get a job if you can't tell time and you can't tell rules and you can't understand the world around you. And so all of this could be solved if we provided a universal basic income to everyone, right?
Yeah, that's probably not going to happen in my life.
Okay, you and then you.
We live in Vancouver, and the housing problem exists there, but it certainly does not appear to be as bad as it is in Portland. What are the policies that you might be aware of that are working there that have not been applied to Portland, and how can Portland learn from Vancouver?
Yeah, I don't know enough about Vancouver to really answer that question. I don't know that I have a good answer to that question. I can do some research and see what Vancouver's up to.
I can too, I should do that.
That's a really good question. Sorry, I don't have an answer for you.
Can you just tell me more about Housing First? So I know this is a thing. I was part of an academic presentation a few years ago where the people who are on the other side of Housing First made a pretty compelling case and basically, really chopped down the person who was really arguing for it. So help us understand what the other side, people who are against Housing First, and it sounds like from what you presented, right? You've got the wraparound and retention services, what really makes this go. So maybe that's part of it. And then my part B of that is what you're doing scalable.
Yeah. Good question. So I think really the arguments against Housing First are when we are looking at programs that aren't fully implementing the Housing First philosophy. And it's really that third component. Lots of people are helping people move from homelessness to housing. There's a ton of rent assistance going out. But a lot of times what happens is that we are providing 6 months or a year of rent assistance to people who have been experiencing homelessness for 2, 3, 4, 10 years. And we think, go stay in this home for 12 months. At the end of 12 months, you'll be resilient, you'll be fine, and you'll be able to maintain your housing on your own. And that's just not true, right? And so there are a lot of programs that have moved people from homelessness to housing. They've provided this 12 months of rent assistance, and people fall right back into homelessness. And so that's a lot of what the critics of Housing First talk about. But they're not really implementing the full Housing First philosophy with that long-term relationships-based case management to help people address whatever underlying issues are going on in their lives so they can keep that housing long-term. There's an example, for about a year, there was a CEO of Transition Projects, TPI, Joy Jones, and she moved here from Northern California, where she was in charge of a 5-county area where they helped people. They took 60-person camps and moved all 60 of these mass encampment people, just living out on the streets. Like if you took someone from the North Park block, 60 people living in the North Park blocks, and you moved them all into the same affordable housing complex. In about 18 months, for about the first 18 months, there was a lot of behavioral challenges, there was a lot of damage to the building, there was a lot of really intensive behavioral health supports, case management, employment training, all kinds of resources were provided to these folks. And after about 18 months, everyone stabilized, and 2 years later, 93% of those folks who had moved directly from a camp into housing were still housed. And when you fully implement Housing First, and it's not just 12 months, it's not sometimes just 24 months like we talked about earlier, sometimes it's 3, 4, 6, 8, 12 years of providing resources to folks whose brains have been rewired because of homelessness trauma, then we can truly end homelessness. Houston, Texas has reduced homelessness by 50% over 10 years by using Housing First. Finland eliminated homelessness by using Housing First. It is the right model as long as we're implementing it to fidelity.
Thank you.
My goodness. Oh my gosh, my Bible.
Great. Friends, thank you for being here. If you'd like to stay involved in this conversation here at First Church, we hope you'll join us on the third Monday of every month at the Land and Housing Circle. You can talk to Diana or myself. Feel free to sign up to volunteer and join us at Path Home on November 18th. What do you got, Diana?
Just a reminder, Diana, could you tell people about November 5th is our next forum?
November 5th is going to feature Laura Moulton, and she is the executive director and founder of Street